In the sprawling mansion on Hillcrest Avenue, where marble floors gleamed and crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows on imported wallpaper, Kaima stood before her mirror, her lips curled in dissatisfaction. The new phone in her hand, a gift from her auntie Neca just 3 months ago, suddenly felt like an insult. Her friends carried the latest models, their cases adorned with designer logos, while she held what she considered a mere basic necessity. What her wealthy friends would think of her if they knew. Little did Kaima know that at that very moment, her auntie Nika sat in her study downstairs, reviewing charitable donations while wrestling with concerns about her niece's growing sense of entitlement. Through the years, Nika had watched the girl she'd rescued from poverty transform into someone she barely recognized. Someone who measured life's worth in brand names and social media likes. The irony of their situation was not lost on the universe. While Kaima spent her days crafting complaints about her aunt's stinginess, Nika spent hers building and maintaining the very wealth that kept their family secure. The same wealth that had lifted Kaima and her mother, Yunoi, from a life where meals had been uncertain and shelter precarious. Auntie could afford so much better, Kaima muttered to her reflection, unaware that her words carried through the mansion's ventilation system to where her aunt sat. She's just being cruel. The girl's fingers traced the edge of her phone case, her mind already crafting the perfect social media post to subtly highlight her aunt's perceived cruelty. But there were secrets in that mansion that Kaima couldn't begin to comprehend. Secrets that lived in the space between Nika's generous spirit and her careful spending. Secrets that whispered of past betrayals and chosen forgiveness. Most importantly, secrets about why Nika had taken in her sister's child despite the wounds that still ached in her heart. In her study, Nika's hand paused over her ledger, her pen hovering above columns of numbers that represented years of disciplined wealth building. She could hear the echo of Kaima's complaints, just as she could hear the whispers of their past, of poverty, of struggle, of the day she'd chosen to reach out and help despite her own pain. The businesswoman's eyes drifted to an old photograph tucked away in her desk drawer, one that showed a younger version of herself standing beside Yunoi, both smiling, before life had complicated their relationship with an unexpected pregnancy and a stolen future. The mansion itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. For in that moment, though neither woman knew it yet, they stood on the precipice of a lesson that would shake their family to its core. Kaima, in her bedroom surrounded by the comforts her aunt's money provided, continued plotting ways to extract more luxury from her situation. And Nika, in her study surrounded by the evidence of her life's work, began formulating a plan that would either save her niece's soul or expose the true depth of her ingratitude. Outside, the sun cast long shadows through the mansion's windows, painting patterns on the floors that connected aunt and niece, patterns that, like their lives, would soon shift dramatically. The universe, in its infinite wisdom, was about to teach them both that the true price of pride is often paid in unexpected currency. For now, though, life in the mansion continued its superficial peace. Kaima dreamed of designer labels and social media fame, while her auntie Nika contemplated the weight of wealth and responsibility. Neither could hear the quiet ticking of fate's clock, counting down to the moment when their carefully constructed world would begin to unravel. In the kitchen, the staff whispered about the growing tension between aunt and niece. They had seen this pattern before. The endless demands, the subtle manipulations, the growing resentment. But even they couldn't predict the shocking turn their household was about to take. For while wealth could buy many things, it couldn't purchase wisdom or gratitude. Those, as both Kaima and Nika would soon discover, had to be earned through far more precious currency, experience, and pain. The weight of unspoken words hung heavy in the mansion's air as days turned into weeks. Kaima's dissatisfaction grew like shadows at sunset, stretching longer and darker across the polished floors of her privileged life. Her social media feeds became digital monuments to her perceived suffering, carefully crafted posts that painted her as a victim of her aunt's miserly ways, each one a betrayal she didn't yet understand the cost of. In the quiet corners of their world, the past refused to stay buried. Nika, watching her niece's behavior with growing concern, found herself increasingly drawn to the old leather-bound photo album she kept locked in her private study. Within its pages lay the story Kaima had never been told, photographs of a younger Neca and Yunoi, sisters whose bond had been fractured by a single choice. There, preserved in fading color, was the engagement party where Neca had stood radiant beside the man she loved, the same man who would later father Kaima with her sister. "Your daughter grows more entitled by the day," Neca remarked one afternoon to Yunoi, who had come to visit. The sisters sat in the garden, where blooming roses offered beauty, but also thorns, much like their shared history. "She has no idea of the struggle it took to build this life." Yunoi shifted uncomfortably in her chair, the ghost of old guilt flickering across her face. She remembered all too well the days before Nika's generosity had rescued them from poverty, days when she and baby Kaima had barely survived on the edges of society. She was too young to remember those times, Yunoi offered weakly, though they both knew this wasn't an excuse. Meanwhile, upstairs in her room, Kaima was staging another photograph for her social media, an artfully arranged shot of her modest surroundings that would fuel the narrative of her aunt's supposed cruelty. What she didn't realize was that each post, each complaint, each demand for more was being carefully documented, becoming evidence in a test she didn't know she was taking. The mansion staff exchanged knowing looks as they went about their duties. They had served the family long enough to recognize the patterns of wealth and its corruption. Some had been there when Neca first brought in her sister and niece, had witnessed the transformation of a grateful child into a demanding young woman. They could sense the breaking point approaching, like the stillness before a storm. One particularly telling afternoon, as Kaima lounged by the pool complaining to her friends about her outdated phone, one of the older maids paused in her work to watch. This same maid remembered holding a much younger Kaima as she cried from hunger, in the days before Neca had stepped in. The irony was sharp enough to cut. Neca, observing from her office window, felt the weight of her decision growing heavier. The plan she had been formulating was risky. It could backfire spectacularly or achieve exactly what she hoped. But watching her niece's increasing displays of ingratitude, she knew something had to be done. The fortune she had built through years of careful business acumen and disciplined living was meant to be a blessing, not a curse. In the kitchen, where the staff gathered for their afternoon break, whispers circulated about Kaima's latest demands. "Did you hear?" One maid murmured to another. "She threw away the new designer bag Madame Neca bought her last week. Said it wasn't the right season's collection." The others shook their heads, remembering the days when Kaima had treasured even the smallest gifts. Unknown to all but Neca herself, the wheels of fate were already in motion. Papers had been drawn up, lawyers consulted, an elaborate plan set in place. It would be a test of character disguised as tragedy, a lesson wrapped in loss. For while Neca had spent years building her wealth, she had also built something far more valuable: wisdom. And she was about to use both to teach her niece the most important lesson of her life. As evening settled over the mansion, Kaima stood on her balcony, scrolling through her phone and dreaming of the lifestyle she thought she deserved. Below, Neca sat in her study, finalizing the details of her plan. Neither woman could hear the quiet ticking of the clock, counting down to the moment when their world would change forever. But change was coming, as inevitable as the sunset painting the sky in shades of warning. The universe, in its infinite wisdom, was about to demonstrate that sometimes the cruelest thing you can do to an entitled person is give them exactly what they want. For Kaima, the path to this lesson would be paved with gold, fool's gold that would tarnish under the weight of her own choices. The news of Auntie Neca's death arrived on an otherwise ordinary afternoon, carried on the trembling lips of Yunoi as she burst into the mansion. Kaima, who had been lounging in the living room critiquing the previous season's curtains, felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Her phone, the same one she had complained about countless times, slipped from her fingers, clattering on the marble floor with a sound that echoed through the suddenly silent house. "Dead?" The word fell from Kaima's lips like a stone into still water, creating ripples of disbelief that spread through the room. How? Her mind raced not with memories of her aunt's kindness, but with sudden calculations of inheritance and possibility. What none of them knew, not Kaima, not Yunoi, not even the loyal staff who had served the family for years, was that at that very moment, Neca sat in a carefully prepared safe house across town, watching the security feeds from her mansion. Her accident had been meticulously planned, every detail orchestrated to test the true nature of those she would leave behind. The next few days unfolded like scenes from a carefully scripted play. The family gathered, tears were shed, and lawyers were summoned. Through it all, Kaima's grief wrestled with her anticipation, her eyes frequently darting to the expensive artifacts that surrounded them. The same items she had once dismissed as inadequate now held new promise as potential inheritance. The reading of the will became the stage for the next act of Neca's carefully crafted drama. The family gathered in the main study, where Neca had spent countless hours building her empire. The lawyer, one of the few people privy to the truth, maintained a perfect poker face as he delivered the news that would change everything. To my niece Kaima, he read, his voice steady and professional, I leave the bulk of my estate, including the mansion and its contents, along with access to my primary accounts. He paused, allowing the words to sink in, knowing they were only the beginning of a much larger plan. Kaima's heart soared even as tears streamed down her face, tears that were more for the fortune she had gained than the aunt she had lost. In her mind, images of luxury and social status bloomed like flowers after rain. Finally, she thought, she would have everything she deserved. From her hidden location, Neca watched the scene unfold on her monitors. Her heart ached at the barely concealed excitement in Kaima's eyes, even as she reminded herself that this pain was necessary. Like a surgeon wielding a scalpel, she knew that sometimes healing required cutting first. The staff, who had served loyally for years, exchanged glances loaded with meaning. They had seen enough of life to recognize the dangerous glint in Kaima's eye, the look of someone who had been given power without earning wisdom. In the kitchen, the old cook crossed herself and whispered a prayer, sensing the storms that were gathering. As Kaima walked through the mansion that evening, her mansion now, her fingers trailed along the expensive wallpaper she had once criticized. Everything looked different through the lens of ownership. The same chandeliers she had dismissed as outdated now sparkled with possibility. The furniture she had labeled as conservative now seemed classic and tasteful. In her hidden sanctuary, Neca reviewed the footage of the day's events. Her plan was in motion, the trap set with golden bait. She had spent years building her fortune through careful decisions and ethical choices. Now she would watch as Kaima either proved worthy of that legacy or demonstrated why she had never deserved it. The universe held its breath as night fell over the mansion. In her new master bedroom, formerly her aunt's suite, Kaima lay awake planning the changes she would make. Her social media accounts would soon tell a new story, not of deprivation, but of abundance. Not of an aunt's cruelty, but of a young heiress's rise to prominence. Little did she know that every post, every decision, every moment of the coming days would be carefully monitored and documented. For while Neca had given Kaima the keys to the kingdom, she had also created a test that would reveal the true nature of her character. As the mansion settled into silence, two women lay awake in different locations, one dreaming of the luxury she would finally grasp, the other watching and waiting for the lesson to unfold. Between them stretched a web of deception born of love and desperation, a deception that would either save a soul or reveal its irredeemable nature. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the greatest test of Kaima's life was about to begin, though she mistook it for her greatest triumph. Power, like wine, has a way of revealing what lies beneath the surface. In the weeks following her inheritance, Kaima's transformation was swift and absolute. The mansion that had once echoed with Neca's measured footsteps now rang with the sharp clicks of Kaima's designer heels, each step a declaration of her new authority. It was on a rain-streaked morning that Chica, Kaima's cousin, arrived at the mansion's doors. Her eyes were rimmed red, her college acceptance letter clutched in trembling hands. The same letter that Auntie Neca had been so proud of now seemed like a cruel joke. The tuition deadline loomed, and with Neca gone, Chica's dreams of graduation threatened to crumble. Please, Kaima. Chica's voice wavered as she stood in the grand foyer, where crystal chandeliers cast rainbow shadows on her tears. It's my final semester, Auntie Neca had promised, but Kaima, lounging on the imported Italian sofa she'd recently purchased, merely examined her fresh manicure. Promises die with the person who made them, she replied, her words sharp enough to cut. Though, if you're that desperate. A cold smile curved her lips. The mansion does need new maids. From her hidden observation room, Neca watched this exchange. Her hands clenched so tight her knuckles went white. She had anticipated Kaima's potential for cruelty, but witnessing it still felt like a knife to her heart. The situation grew darker still when Adiku, their uncle's wife, arrived the following week. The hospital corridors had become her second home as her husband's condition worsened, each beeping machine a reminder of mounting medical bills. She had swallowed her pride to come here, to kneel before a girl young enough to be her daughter. Your uncle might not survive without this surgery, Adiku pleaded, her traditional wrapper crumpled in her anxious hands. Kaima, please remember all the times he carried you as a child. Kaima's response was to summon her wealthy friends for an impromptu audience. You want help? She asked, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Then dance for us. Entertain us. Show us what you're willing to do for it. Her friends tittered behind their expensive phones, cameras ready to capture the humiliation. In her surveillance room, Neca fought the urge to end this charade immediately. But she knew that sometimes the only way to excise poison was to let it rise to the surface. Every moment was being recorded, every cruel word documented. The mansion staff, once loyal to Neca, now moved like shadows along the walls, trying to avoid Kaima's mercurial temper. They watched as she forced Chica to wash her designer clothes by hand, claiming the washing machine wasn't gentle enough. They winced as she made Adiku clean the same floor 3 times, declaring she could still see spots that existed only in her imagination. Remember when she first came here? One maid whispered to another as they folded linens. So thin, so grateful for every little thing. The other nodded, remembering how young Kaima had once shared her desserts with the staff's children. That girl seemed as distant now as a forgotten dream. Social media became Kaima's theater, each post a carefully curated display of her newfound wealth. The same platforms where she had once complained of deprivation now showcased her excess. Her former post lamenting her aunt's cruelty remained visible, a digital testament to her ingratitude that would later come back to haunt her. From her hidden vantage point, Neca methodically documented everything, each act of cruelty, each humiliation inflicted, each denial of help. All were carefully logged and time-stamped. The evidence mounted like storm clouds on the horizon, building toward an inevitable breakdown. One particularly dark evening, as Kaima hosted another lavish party, an elderly woman appeared at the mansion's gate seeking help. Her clothes were worn but clean, her dignity intact despite her poverty. Please, she called out, her voice carrying across the manicured lawn. Just a little food. Kaima's response was to increase the volume of her party music, drowning out the woman's pleas. Security, she called out, waving a champagne glass. Remove that eyesore from my property. The woman's quiet dignity as she was led away struck a sharp contrast with the gaudy celebrations within. The universe, ever patient, watched as Kaima dug her own grave with golden shovels. Each act of cruelty was another nail in the coffin of her inheritance, though she was too blind with power to see it. The lessons Neca had tried to teach through years of measured generosity were being undone in a matter of weeks by unlimited access to wealth. In her hidden sanctuary, Neca watched and waited. The time for revelation approached, the moment when all of Kaima's choices would come due. Like a master weaver, she had created a tapestry of opportunity and temptation. Now, thread by thread, Kaima was unraveling it with her own hands. The mansion, which had stood for generations as a symbol of Neca's careful stewardship, seemed to hold its breath. Its walls, which had witnessed countless acts of both kindness and cruelty, waited for justice to tip its scales. For while wealth could be inherited in an instant, wisdom, it seemed, was a lesson that had to be learned the hard way. The lawyer's call came on a bright morning that belied the storm about to break. Kaima, fresh from a shopping spree that had cost more than most families earn in a year, felt her world tilt when her phone buzzed with his name. Miss Kaima. His voice carried a gravity that pierced through her usual indifference. There's been a development regarding your inheritance. You must come to the office immediately. The urgency in his tone sent a chill down her spine, though she tried to dismiss it with her usual hauteur. In her hidden sanctuary, Neca watched the call on her monitors, knowing the carefully orchestrated endgame was beginning. Months of documentation, of watching her niece's descent into cruelty, had built to this moment. She adjusted her screen to watch Kaima's reaction, noting how her niece's hand trembled slightly as she set down the phone. The law office, with its wood-paneled walls and leather-bound books, seemed to close in around Kaima as the lawyer pulled out a thick file. "Your aunt," he began, his voice measured, "left specific conditions attached to your inheritance." He laid out photographs, screenshots, and witness statements, an arsenal of evidence documenting every act of cruelty she had committed since inheriting the estate. Kaima's perfectly manicured nails dug into the leather armrests as she watched her world begin to crumble. There was the video of Adaku dancing for her amusement, the screenshots of her social media posts mocking her aunt's memory, the testimonies from staff about her treatment of Chica. "This can't be happening," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The lawyer continued methodically, laying out document after document, each one another nail in the coffin of her inherited wealth. Meanwhile, in the mansion, Yunoi sat in what had once been her sister's study, running her fingers over the familiar desk. She had no idea that at that very moment, her sister was alive, watching, waiting. The weight of old guilt pressed down on her. Guilt about the man she had stolen, about the daughter she had failed to raise with gratitude, about the sister whose generosity she had taken for granted. Back in the lawyer's office, Kaima's desperation mounted. "There must be something I can do," she pleaded, her carefully constructed facade cracking. "I'll change. I'll do better. I'll help Chica with her tuition. I'll pay for Uncle's surgery." "I'm afraid it's too late," the lawyer replied, his voice firm but not unkind. "The evidence is substantial and conclusive. The estate will be transferred to your cousin Chica, effective immediately." The universe, in its infinite wisdom, seemed to hold its breath as Kaima stumbled out of the office. Her designer heels, bought with inherited money, clicked unsteadily on the marble floor, each step taking her closer to a revelation she couldn't yet imagine. But the true shock was yet to come. As Kaima pushed open the mansion's doors, her mind racing with plans to salvage something from this disaster, she stopped dead in her tracks. There, seated in the living room as if she had never left, was Auntie Neca. The silence that followed was deafening. Kaima's expensive handbag slipped from her nerveless fingers, hitting the floor with a thud that echoed through the mansion. Her aunt's eyes, clear and penetrating, held none of their usual warmth. "How?" Kaima's voice cracked, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. "You're dead. You died." "Did I?" Nika's voice was quiet, but carried the weight of months of observation. "Or did I simply give you enough rope to hang yourself with?" In that moment, the full weight of her actions crashed down on Kaima. Every cruel word, every selfish decision, every moment of ingratitude played through her mind like a horrific slideshow. She could see now how thoroughly she had been tested, and how completely she had failed. The staff, gathering at the edges of the room, watched with a mixture of relief and vindication. They had known somehow that Madame Neca would not abandon them to Kaima's cruelty forever. Their faith had been rewarded. Yunoi, summoned by the commotion, stood frozen in the doorway. The sight of her sister, alive, powerful, and righteous in her judgment, brought her to her knees. In Nika's face, she could see echoes of their shared past, of old wounds and new reckonings. And through it all, Nika sat straight-backed in her chair, every inch the businesswoman who had built an empire through wisdom and restraint. "Did you think," she asked softly, "that wealth was a right rather than a responsibility? Did you imagine that cruel power would bring you happiness?" The mansion itself seemed to hold its breath, its walls witnesses to this final act of a carefully orchestrated drama. Outside, the sun continued to shine, indifferent to the human drama unfolding within. But inside, in that moment of truth, the price of pride was finally being paid in full. In the silence that followed Nika's revelation, the mansion seemed to exhale years of accumulated secrets. Kaima stood trembling before her very much alive aunt, her designer outfit suddenly feeling like a costume. A child playing at wealth and power. The weight of her actions pressed down on her shoulders, making her expensive clothes feel as heavy as chains. Why? The question escaped Kaima's lips in a whisper, though she wasn't sure what exactly she was asking. Why the deception? Why the test? Why had she failed so spectacularly? Nika rose from her chair with the quiet dignity that had always characterized her movements. Because some lessons cannot be taught. They must be lived. Her eyes swept the room, taking in Yunoi's trembling form in the doorway, the watching staff, and finally settling on Kaima. You needed to see who you truly were when no one was watching. Or rather, when you thought no one was watching. From hidden panels in the walls, screens emerged, displaying footage of the past months. Kaima watched herself in horror, seeing for the first time how others saw her. The cruel smirk as she forced Ataku to dance, the casual dismissal of Chica's education, the constant parade of excess while family members struggled. Your aunt gave you everything. Yunoi finally spoke, her voice thick with shame. Just as she gave me everything, even after. She couldn't finish the sentence, but the weight of old betrayals hung heavy in the air. Nika's voice cut through the tension. Perhaps that was my mistake. In trying to protect you from the poverty I once knew, I sheltered you from the very struggles that built my character. She moved to the window, looking out over the grounds where she had built her empire. Wealth without wisdom is like a weapon without training, dangerous to everyone, including its wielder. The staff began to file out discreetly, but Nika raised a hand to stop them. Stay. You are part of this lesson too. Your loyalty, your quiet dignity in the face of cruelty. These are the true measures of character I had hoped my niece would learn. Chica and Ataku were summoned, arriving with the uncertainty of those who had learned to expect the worst. Their eyes widened at the sight of Nika, alive and in command once more. Kaima couldn't meet their gaze, the memory of her treatment of them burning like acid in her throat. The inheritance, Nika announced, her voice carrying the weight of final judgment, will be divided. Chica will receive the bulk of the estate, having demonstrated the compassion and wisdom needed to manage it properly. She turned to Kaima. You, my niece, will return to a simpler life. Perhaps there, you can learn what I failed to teach you here. Kaima's legs gave way, and she sank to the floor, her carefully constructed world completely shattered. Where will I go? She asked, sounding for the first time like the lost child she truly was. Back to where we started, Yunoi answered, moving to help her daughter up. To our old house, where we lived before your aunt's generosity changed our lives. The irony was lost on no one. They were returning to the very place they had once been so desperate to escape. But Nika wasn't finished. This isn't a punishment, Kaima. It's an opportunity. One I hope you'll use more wisely than the last. She moved to her desk and pulled out a small ledger. You'll have enough for basic needs, but anything beyond that, you'll have to earn. Not just with money, but with character. The universe, ever the patient teacher, watched as understanding finally began to dawn in Kaima's eyes. The tears that fell now were different from any she had shed before. Not tears of self-pity or manipulation, but of genuine remorse. Chica, demonstrating the generosity that had earned her the inheritance, stepped forward. I'll help them settle in, she offered, though Kaima had shown her no such kindness. Ataku, too, nodded her forgiveness, though the memory of her humiliation was still fresh. As the sun set on this day of revelations, the mansion prepared for yet another transformation. Staff members moved with renewed purpose, knowing their beloved Madame Nika had returned. Chica began to learn the responsibilities of managing the estate, her natural compassion already showing in her plans for family support. And Kaima, stripped of her borrowed power, faced the longest journey of all, the path to genuine gratitude and wisdom. As she packed her designer clothes into boxes that would be sold to pay for her uncle's surgery, she finally understood what her aunt had tried to teach her all along, that true wealth lay not in possessions, but in the character with which one wielded them. Nika watched it all from her study, her heart heavy but hopeful. The lesson had been cruel, perhaps, but sometimes the hardest teachings were the ones most needed. As night fell over the mansion, she said a quiet prayer, not for wealth or power, but for wisdom to guide them all in the days ahead. For in the end, the price of pride had been paid not in money, but in understanding. And though the cost had been high, the lesson was priceless. That character, once lost, must be rebuilt brick by brick, and that true gratitude grows only in soil fertilized by humility.